Aloha and welcome to Ehana Kako. We're here every week on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroots Institute. Well, you know it's that season again. Time to vote for our politicians, the incumbents, as well as potential future ones. There's probably no more interesting place to do this than in Hawaii. So many traditions, old and new, merge here. So many directions, east and west, come together. Today I have an expert in politics, somebody whom you may have seen as a pundit, perhaps, or perhaps as a professor. He's the director of the University of Hawaii Public Policy Center and an instructor as well, a professor in political science at the University of Hawaii. He's come to learn quite a bit about politics in Hawaii, and we're going to have a fun conversation. We're going to cover everything from Donald Trump to Bernie Sanders, as well as the role of and future of the Republican and Democratic parties. Colin, aloha and welcome to the program.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, glad to have you on board, and you're doing a great job of keeping the public informed. Love to see you on the news every now and then.
Thank you so much. It's really a lot of fun to do it.
And every now and then you get to comment on what's going on in the political races.
I do, increasingly frequently. And
now,
it's really kept me on my toes this season.
When you were in 7th grade, did you just look up at the clouds and say, someday when I grow up, I want to become a pundit?
I don't think so. I think when the pundits came on when I was in 7th grade, I wanted to change the channel.
How about that? Well, you know, here in Hawaii, we are in some ways remote from the rest of the United States. That may offend people, the fact that I say that, but we are the most isolated archipelago in the entire world. And yet presidential politics has seemed to figure big time here in a lot of local conversations. So what do you account for that?
Well, I mean, in part it's just because this is what everyone hears on the media. I mean, here in Hawaii and on the mainland. I think this year in particular, it's been more difficult for people to make their choices because we have candidates on the extreme left and on the extreme right, and a lot of the traditional candidates really have been crowded out.
Well, would you have thought at the beginning of this race that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders would be the most talked about names here in the Aloha State?
You know, Keli'i, absolutely not. I was the one months ago saying he's not going to go anywhere. I mean, this is a reality show phenomenon. No one's going to vote for Trump. And I didn't say that just because I didn't think he was a credible candidate. It was because there's a lot of political science research that says really it's the party establishment that at the end of the day decides the candidate, because there's all of these rules built into the nomination process. Your party elites, like our own elected officials, tend to have a lot of influence in who gets nominated. And because Trump was an outsider in the Republican Party, and Bernie Sanders, remember, Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat. He's a caucuses with the Democrats, but he's an independent. I thought neither of them really had a chance. And yet here we are. So, you know, social scientists, we try, but it's a soft science.
Well, you can take your crystal ball out and polish it up a little bit, but what did you think about the large turnout of Republicans at the Republican caucuses? 4 years ago, that was about 10,000 people. This year, there were 15,000. And it's not like the Republicans have been growing as a party or have been taking any prominence in public policy in any big way, but the numbers are incredible. What do you think?
Well, I think you can attribute most of this to the Trump phenomenon. I mean, you're right. The Republican Party here has been this beleaguered, loyal opposition for a very, very long time. So I don't think it was a part of the local party that grew or managed to get more voters on the Republican rolls. It's that a lot of people who otherwise are disengaged, who don't really participate in the process all that much, turned out to vote, because at least in Hawaii we have open primaries, so all you have to do is show up on that day, say you're going to vote Republican, and you can participate in the caucus. And because we don't have a lot of Republicans here, when you get a number of energized voters who are independents or folks who just haven't voted in years, when they show up, you can really swing the results.
What do you think? Were those Republicans showing up in numbers like 15,000, or did that include a good component of people who may not carry any party card other than for that day?
Well, I think that's the story. I don't think it was your loyal Hawaii Republicans, the people who show up for the caucuses, who, when there isn't anyone all that exciting on the ballot. It wasn't them. it was people who may have considered themselves Republicans. I mean, they might be conservatives, but for the most part, I don't think they were people who vote all that often, who feel really alienated from the political system on the mainland, and probably particularly here where the Democratic Party is so dominant.
What did you think when the numbers started coming in? And well, by this time we'd seen Trump win everywhere, but when they came in from Molokai or from Kauai, Trump swept the neighbor islands as well as Oahu.
He did, and this is a story that hasn't been reported much in the mainstream media. How this tells a broader story about the Trump candidacy, the fact that he was able to do so well in Hawaii, and not just in the more conservative suburbs of Honolulu like Hawaii Kai, but in the outer islands as well, which means that he does have appeal to non-white voters. I mean, this is what this data seemed to demonstrate. People who just feel frustrated with the process overall, don't seem to be turned off by some of his anti-immigration rhetoric, and still showed up to vote for Trump.
You use the term non-white, but is it ethnicity that's the real demographic that connects with Donald Trump? Is there some other demographic category that you think connects?
Oh, I don't think it's ethnicity. I only made that point because people have painted him as a racist because they've said this rhetoric would turn off minority voters. And in Hawaii, we see that that's not necessarily the case. What connects people with Trump, I think, is a frustration. One thing we know from the data is that and this is not a criticism of Trump, it's just an empirical fact, where Trump has done the best are basically places where people are struggling the most. Rural America, places that really have not benefited from free trade agreements, places where you've seen a decline in manufacturing jobs or just good union jobs altogether. And maybe on the outer islands, you could talk about the traditional sugar jobs that used to be fairly well paid.
Sure. So you're saying that Trump appeals not only to a broad spectrum of the common man, so to speak, but also to those who are really struggling with the economy, struggling with surviving in the world that they believe their politicians have given them.
I think that's primarily where Trump succeeds. I mean, you can draw a very close relationship between the places that are suffering the most economically and support for
Well, this
Trump.
brings it back home to Hawaii, something that we talk about and measure a lot at the Grassroots Institute when we talk about our economy, the cost of living, how much it costs to buy a carton of milk or a box of eggs, or even more than that, a house and so forth. So do you think that the Hawaii voters are feeling this kind of angst and kind of well, shall we say, discouragement from the condition of the economy?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to support Trump in the general or they're about to switch their loyalties to the Republican Party.
But you're saying he appeals to people who feel that.
Yes, and so that does have an appeal here in Hawaii where people, I mean, the unique thing about Hawaii perhaps is that jobs here are still reasonably well paid, but the cost of living has increased so much that even if your job would be well paid on the mainland, it doesn't count for much here. And people have said that, we're living 3 families to a home. There's no way young people who are starting a family could dream about buying a house in Honolulu when you're talking about $800,000. I mean, you have to be very wealthy indeed to buy a house here. So
now, Republican leaders and the rank and file of the visible Republican Party have generally supported Cruz or Rubio or Kasich.
That's right.
But we didn't see them any of those 3 candidates prevail. What is that saying about the Hawaii voter?
Well, this is another fascinating story. I mean, it does demonstrate, and it's not just here in Hawaii, it's on the mainland too, that the Republican leadership, the elected Republican officials, or in Hawaii's case, some of the most prominent Republicans are formerly elected officials like Charles DeJoux, they don't seem to have much sway over the voters. I mean, the Republicans in Hawaii have always tried to position themselves as a very moderate party. They are the alternative to the Democratic Party, but they always are very careful to say, we are far more to the left or far more reasonable than the mainland Republicans. And I used to call it the Southern accent problem, that so many Republican senators and Republican officials on the mainland are from the South, and I think it makes people a bit wary. But here in Hawaii, there's always kind of been this reasonable, kinder face presented for the party, a more moderate face And that didn't succeed here. And I think the Republican leadership is very frustrated and frankly a little disturbed by Trump's victory. I mean, think about Pat Psyche saying she'd wash his mouth out with soap and she couldn't believe anyone would vote for him. Think about Beth Fukumoto Chang saying that, frankly, she'd be horrified if Trump won the Hawaii caucus.
Do you think some people have hitched their political careers inadvertently to their comments on Trump? In particular, as you mentioned, the party leader Pat Psyche, or perhaps Beth Fukumoto Chang, who is a Republican who opposed Trump.
Well, I don't think it would hurt districts. I mean, Republicans here face a very difficult situation where it's extremely unlikely that they'd be elected to statewide office except for extraordinary things like a three-way race.
Well, I've got one more question about Trump before we jump to Bernie.
Sure.
You and I are policy wonks. When somebody talks about immigration policy or talks about the economy, we'd like to see what the platform really is, look at the mechanisms and so forth. Have you felt that it's not been that easy to get that information out from Donald Trump's campaign, and yet there's this phenomenal support for him despite details of policy?
Well, this is the dangerous thing. I mean, this is why people have referred to him as a demagogue, and I don't think that's entirely untrue in some cases. I mean, he has provided so few details that anyone can read anything into any of his policies. I mean, I think, the extraordinary thing is the last few weeks they've been interviewing Donald Trump supporters, and many of them will say, well, I don't really agree with Trump on his statements on Muslims or his statements even on illegal immigrants. But then they'll say, I don't think he seriously believes that. He wouldn't do that when he's elected to office. And it's very hard for us to say what policies he'd actually support because he doesn't have a background in politics, so you can't use history. And all of his policies are pretty vague. I mean, they don't really go much beyond talking points.
That's right. Now, the entire nation is stunned at how well Bernie Sanders has done against Secretary Clinton, but in Hawaii?
Yes. I mean, Sanders is similar to Trump. I mean, like Trump, a few, 6 months ago, I would have said, well, Sanders is kind of like, people think of him as the eccentric old uncle. I mean, he has these ideas, and he sometimes he makes a point, but he wouldn't be electable on a national level, and yet here he is. And Sanders taps into the same frustration as Trump. I mean, his support not only comes from kind of the traditional hard left, I mean, mainly made up of university professors and some very liberal professionals, but also college students and increasingly blue-collar workers. And that's really where Sanders has been able to make his gains.
But to give him credit, does his message actually resonate with a great deal of the Hawaii population? We come from the plantations, we've been taken care of, we have high levels of social services, we've got the union workers and so forth. And we've been living under a type of socialism, and Sanders comes right out and valorizes that word. Do you think that there really is resonation ideologically with Sanders?
I sure do. I mean, this is a state that's always embraced big government policies ever since statehood. We were, of course, the first state to have, for example, healthcare mandates for employment. We have the second or third highest union density in the nation. So there's a lot of support for these policies. I mean, a certain socialism is not a bad word in Hawaii. And if that helps people, if people see a way through that to confront our own problems, which are more about the cost of living than wage inequality, then I think you could have significant support for Sanders. On the other hand, our Democratic Party is a conservative Democratic Party. They don't tend to back more left-leaning candidates, except for Barack Obama, but there are obvious reasons for that because he grew up here. So that really does give Hillary an edge because we're a traditional union state, the kind of state that would normally back Hillary Clinton.
Well, one would think that we would back Hillary Clinton rather than Bernie Sanders, and in fact, in part because President Obama is a favorite son of Hawaii. So despite that, how is it that Mrs. Clinton is not doing quite so well?
It's because, like Trump, Bernie has received a lot of support from voters who are normally checked out. I mean, there's a lot of people who never participate in here. We have, as you well know, one of the lowest voter turnouts in the nation. So you get somebody like Sanders who makes people care about participating in local politics here. I mean, yesterday he had a very well-attended rally down at Church of the Crossroads. There's a lot of buzz and excitement as his campaign There was a rally on the UH Manoa campus, which is very unusual for UH. Tends to be a pretty, politically uninvolved campus. So you're going to see the same thing, a bunch of voters who don't normally vote coming to vote for Bernie Sanders.
Well, when we come back from a break, I want to ask you some broader questions about Hawaii as a virtual one-party state.
Sure.
We're talking today with Colin Moore of the University of Hawaii. I'm Keli'i Akina on Ehana Kako, and we'll be back on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network in just 1 minute, so don't go away.
Aloha, namaskar, and hello. My name is Anu Hittel, and I host a show, Climate Change Beyond Outrage. In it, we go beyond outrage to look at solutions to climate problems facing people, nations, and the world. Join me every Tuesday at 1 o'clock Hawaii Standard Time. See you then.
Hello, I'm Stephen Katz, and I'm the host of Shrink Wrap, which comes to you live every Tuesday at 3 p.m. on thinktechhawaii.com, and then it's repeated again whenever you want if you go to the website. On our show, we will be talking to all different kinds of therapists, psychologists, psychoanalysts, psychiatrists, people who talk about the mind, the brain, and about different ways to find happiness. I myself am a marriage and family therapist in practice here in Hawaii, and I hope you will join us because I've got a lot to learn, you've got a lot to learn, and it's a great ride. Thanks a lot. See you soon.
Welcome back to Ehana Kako, here every week on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. At the Grassroot Institute, we like to say Ehana Kako. It sounds a lot like a venerable Hawaiian saying, e pule kako, which means let's pray together. At the Grassroot Institute, we also like to say Ehana Kako, let's work together. Let's work together for a better economy, government, and society. Because think of the terrible alternative. If we don't work together, nothing gets done. Today, I've got a gentleman in the studio who is working with many people to help us understand better the workings of the state, politically and socially. He is a professor at the University of Hawaii, where he heads the Public Policy Center, the UH Public Policy Center. Colin Moore. Colin, great talking with you today.
You too.
Let's pick up. You referred to Hawaii, in fact, I referred to it as well, as a one-party state. And that's not a slight toward any party, it's just basically the practical reality.
That's right. I mean, it's just an empirical fact. We have one member of the Hawaii State Senate, a handful of members of the State House. More than any other state in the nation, I believe the Democratic Party here dominates. Rhode Island is a close second. So it really is a one-party state. And sometimes people define that by meaning that the Democrats in Hawaii can pass anything. There's no way for the Republicans to stop them at any point.
Now, whether it's the Republicans in control, the Democrats in control, whether it's a blue state or a red state, what are the problems with there being virtually one party in control?
Well, the first is just an obvious problem, which is that you don't get the natural give and take of a democracy. I mean, having a second party, or even a weak second party, playing the role of loyal opposition means that you have to reconsider legislation. I mean, you get pushback from another side. And one value that comes from that is that you get more information. I mean, if you're trying to defeat a bill or you're questioning a bill, then more of the details rise to the surface. Well, the problems are exposed.
You are right, I think, about information, because sometimes information shines a light on things the party in power doesn't want you to see. Well, one thing that I've struggled with for years, and we have at the Grassroot Institute, is that the budget document presented by the executive and then passed by the predominantly Democratic legislature is not the easiest document to wade through and read. And we have a good number of state workers who have a real difficult time finding out exactly what it's saying. But it's the Republican Minority Research Group that posts a computer website that helps you wade through that thing. And it's a very useful tool. You can see exactly where your money is going and what it's doing. Is that the kind of information you're talking about?
That's absolutely right, and I agree with you that that is one of the most valuable services that the Minority Research Office provides. And they shine the light on things that may not necessarily, that the Democratic Party may not necessarily want everyone to be aware of, not because, because of some particularly nefarious reason, but because it's something the public might object to And they just rather not talk about that detail. Well, the Minority Research Office brings light to that and makes it public.
So in line with that, when there's one party in control, more decisions are made behind the scenes. More decisions are made with conservative inertia.
That's right. Because there aren't these public fights, what happens is that, I mean, there are still real disagreements. As anyone who follows local politics knows, there's a variety of different factions. They go by a variety of clever names. But for the most part, those fights are had behind closed doors at the Capitol or somewhere off-site. And that's why everything in, I think, Hawaii politics, at least at the state level, seems to happen so quickly, right? It seems like nothing is happening. You're not sure which bills are important. And then all of a sudden, everything gets decided.
But what you're saying is that the position has been worked on. The machinery has been in place,
Exactly.
produced what it's going to give us, and then finally it emerges when it has to be validated at the legislature.
Exactly, but then, of course, it's presented as this fait accompli, that there's no opportunity for the public to really weigh all the sides. There's no opportunity for journalists to dig into the details.
Well, one of the things we see in our state is a lot of journalistic attention to protest. For example, many people believe that it was a group of people in a canoe that stopped the super ferry, or that it was some protesters on Mauna Kea that stopped the TMT, or that it is a group of environmentalists that stopped the next era merger and so forth. If I apply what you're saying, there's really probably a lot more going on behind the scenes in a one-party state.
That's absolutely right, but it's very difficult to see that. So that's why I think, as you suggest, the protests get so much attention. Partly, too, we don't have a lot of protests in Hawaii. I mean, the few that we have that really rise to prominence, like the TMT protest, like the Super Ferry protest, those get a ton of media attention because of the one-party state, and because I think culturally here in Hawaii, people don't tend to favor big public disagreements. It's just really something that seems not to be done.
So are you saying that the one-party state goes hand in hand with a don't rock the boat culture?
That's exactly what I'm saying. I mean, where deference is important, where really deferring to senior members, in this case of the party or of the legislature, is very important for your rise up as a junior member. And I think this filters down to all levels of society. So that, along with a one-party state, means that we don't have a lot of disagreements, which means it's very difficult to follow policy.
Now, within single-party systems, such as the Communist Party in Beijing, ultimately, when you are totalistic, you fracture.
Yes.
You become actually the equivalent of multiple parties within you. Do you think that's happening to any extent within the Democratic Party of Hawaii?
Certainly it is at the Senate. I mean, you saw that with the so-called Senate coup in the last session, where we got a new Senate president. So you see this occasionally, and there are these various factions. But the problem with that, as you suggest with the Chinese example, is it's very difficult to, as an outsider, to understand their disagreements and to understand where the cleavages in public policy really are. And that's not how democracy is supposed to work. I mean, that's one reason the system is set up to produce fights. I mean, it's not really supposed to produce consensus that doesn't emerge into public fights. It's supposed to do that.
Sure.
So everyone can see where people stand on each issue.
You know, there are many Democrats in public office today who actually lament the fact that they don't have a significant opposition party. It's almost like athletes who want to be competing against top world-class athletes for the good of the system. And so it's not just Republicans that lament the small numbers of Republicans.
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, people who wouldn't consider themselves Republicans at all lament the fact that there is no opposition party, because I think people who are careful observers of democracy realize that there are serious costs to having no opposition party.
It's kind of hard to blame the Republicans for anything in this state.
So I want to make that point clear, because I think sometimes, even among Republicans, the thought is, well, if we could just get better candidates, if we could have a slightly more compelling set of public policies. I don't think that's true. In fact, I would submit that the Republicans have had a very strong set of candidates. I mean, some of the smartest people who've run for office recently, people like Charles Dejoux, people like Beth Fukumoto Chang, some of the best people in the legislature in local politics. But the fact that they're Republicans means that it is extraordinarily difficult for them to have much success.
Well, with that, let's switch our focus now to the Republicans themselves. What do you see going on in that party? That party, as you said earlier, has been beleaguered. That party that has dwindled in numbers. That party that has become less than an opposition voice in terms of the quantity of what they can do. What do you see going on with the party?
I think this, for them, is a time of real soul searching. I think a lot of our local Republicans are very upset about what has happened at the national level, and are very upset that Hawaii ended up endorsing Donald Trump. Because, as I suggested earlier, they've always thought of themselves as a moderate alternative to the mainland party, and I think they've always suggested that they can have electoral success here if they can be more moderate. Now that may not be true. I mean, they're seeing evidence that, I mean, I hate to suggest this, but just as a pure political strategist, I would say they'd probably have more electoral success if they were a little more ideologically pure. You know, if you picked up some of the disengaged voters, people who really are more on the right here, and you see this with Donald Trump. I mean, and I think this, for example, is something that like Representative McDermott would like to do.
What do you think of the divide between party leadership and their endorsement of the more traditional candidates and the rank and file that apparently have endorsed Donald Trump?
Well, this, I mean, so you're right. This is, I mean, this of course is something that happened at the national level as well. But you had Charles Dejoux working for Kasich's campaign. You had Duke Iona endorsing Rubio, I believe,
yes.
And others endorsing Cruz. This, I think it is that they, I mean, I think this just caught them a bit off guard. But it also shows that the people who are left here, I mean, there are still a small number of Republicans. They're not very deferential to the party leaders here. I mean, it's not as if that really matters to them who the Republican leadership would like them to vote for. I mean, these really are people who are frustrated with the entire system and vote for Donald Trump in part as a protest.
As we look ahead to the 2016 elections, it doesn't look as though the Republicans have fielded a large stable of candidates to challenge in any districts, really. There have been some defections from the party over the last few years,
yes.
And they might continue. And one of the most senior of Republicans, in fact, the most senior Republican in office, Sam Sloan, is facing a very strong challenge from a Democrat, Stanley Chang, in his own district. So do you think it's possible that we might actually see a decline in the Republican numbers? And just prognosticate for a moment, what would we see happen, especially if the Republicans completely lost access to the Senate?
I think that's likely. So for one, Republicans here have a hard time retaining young, talented members. I mean, you saw the defection from Aaron Ling Johansson, and partly that's because they don't really see a future in the Republican Party. I mean, if they want to rise to more positions of prominence, if they want to be committee chairs, then they have to be Democrats. And I think many of them, particularly those who think of themselves as moderates, are willing to make that decision because, you know, frankly, we have a lot of Democrats in Hawaii. We're a very democratic state. That doesn't mean we're a very progressive state. A lot of those Democrats are conservative Democrats. So it's not always such a harsh transition from being a liberal Republican to a conservative Democrat. So Sam Sloan being challenged was your second question. I think Stanley Chang has a very good chance to beat him. I mean, he has tremendous name recognition. I think he's very well respected by members of his district, but he is a Republican. And there's a lot of people who live in that Hawaii Kai district that are probably Democrats. And if they're given an alternative for a young, ambitious, smart, well-known candidate who's also very talented at raising money like Stanley Chang, he could lose.
What would happen constitutionally or just practically in the state Senate if there was no opposition? And I'm just thinking of the fact that right now there is a Republican caucus room or a majority caucus room, a minority caucus room. What would happen?
It's a fascinating question, Keli'i. I mean, we're kind of will be in uncharted waters at that point. What if there's no Republican member of the Senate, then there's all of these positions that sort of go unfilled. There is no, there's no minority members at all. And the system is built with the expectation that there always will be at least a few members of the opposition party.
Right.
So I don't really know what happens, to be honest.
It would be quite interesting if a libertarian eked his way in.
Well, so you're right. So that's another possibility, which you could see. I mean, I really think the time is ripe for the emergence of a third party. It may be that the Republicans just cannot get any success here because of the mainland
Well,
party.
let's go to a break and
Sure.
pick up on that intriguing thought, the possibility of a third party in the state of Hawaii. My guest today, Professor Colin Moore at the University of Hawaii. We'll be right back after this short break. Don't go away.
Aloha, I'm Rachel Yergin with Aging with Grace. Please join us every Tuesday on thinktech.com.
Aloha, my name is Justina Spiritu, and I'm the co-host of Hawaii Farmers Series. This is my co-host, Matthew Johnson, and you can catch us every Thursday at 4 p.m. at thinktechhawaii.com. What do we talk about, Matt?
So on Hawaii Farmers Series, we're going to be bringing on the farmers and also supporter of farmers, including restaurants, caterers, as well as government supporters and nonprofits to hear their background stories and understanding our local ag community just a little bit better.
Yeah, essentially there's a lot more that goes into farming and the local food community beyond just producing the food. And we want to feature and get the background story on all these folks and see how we all work together as a community. So join us every Thursday. Aloha.
Welcome to our final segment today of A Hana Kako, here every week on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'd like to tip my hat to Jay Fidel, Carol Munn Lee, and all of the wonderful staff and volunteers who make Think Tech Hawaii work. They produce about 30 to 35 hours of original content from downtown Honolulu that goes out across the world, and you can access that at thinktechhawaii.com. Now, back to today's fascinating discussion with Colin Moore. We've been talking about politics in Hawaii, and I'm going to take it from the top with a question, Colin. When you got here to Hawaii, you remarked at how different we were from the rest of the country, and I remember reading that what impressed you was the fact that our politicians had to go through this sacred rite of standing on the street corners and waving with signs in order to humble themselves before the people and get into office. Now that you've been here for a while, is there anything deeper that you recognize about the uniqueness of Hawaii politics?
Sure, yes. So after I got over the sign waving, I think the thing that strikes me the most is, and I mentioned this before, the lack of public disagreement by major leaders. I mean, it really, and when things, people are so unwilling to condemn, obviously members of their own party, but even members of the opposition. I mean, there aren't that many public fights. And in some ways you could say that's that's a refreshing thing given how hot politics runs on the mainland. But I think it can be a damaging thing too. I mean, I think it suggests to voters, and it feeds this this perception among voters that all of the decisions that matter here are made behind closed doors, and then things are presented to the public as just a way to inform them about what will happen, as opposed to get their genuine input about those issues.
It also perpetuates the idea that politics is about currying favor, about not publicly speaking against those in power, and that if you toe the line publicly, you're going to be able to do well in the party.
That's right. I mean, in some ways, our party is a very old-fashioned party. I mean, things like, there is still a certain amount of patronage that goes on in Hawaii. I mean, not in a more informal way, but still one that matters. I mean, you see various politicians go from one office, city council, to another office, the House, and they take their staff along with them. I mean, to get a position in the bureaucracy, it's often necessary to have good political connections.
Right. At Grassroots Institute, we did a panel last year in which we brought journalists together, and they discussed the stories that never got reported. And many of those stories were about senior politicians from the congressional level down, for whom the stories would have been embarrassing. And the journalistic media were complicit, and journalists themselves admitted it, that you just in this town don't talk about certain things.
Because they'll be shut out. I mean, that's what these journalists are afraid of. And so they always treat these cases with extreme caution until, for example, it just becomes so obvious that you have to report on the issues, like, for example, the Billy Kenoy scandal.
That's right. When it's a volcano that ultimately
Exactly.
erupts. Now, we were talking about the fact that we are really a one-party state functionally, and that it's possible that the second party minority, the Republicans, could actually lose out even more to the Democrats in the next election, and we might even have one house that lacks any minority party member, the Senate. Do you think that a third party might emerge in the light of this?
Well, this is the time when you really would see a third party emerge, when it becomes clear that the Republicans are just no longer a functional political party here. I think you could see it from two sides. I think there might be an opportunity to have a Libertarian party, one that has a carefully crafted message. I mean, people could run as independents, but with a Libertarian streak, or a Green Party. I mean, one issue that has motivated tremendous numbers of people, I mean, are environmental issues. You saw this around the GMO
Right.
movement, where they won that extraordinary victory in Maui. And so it's a possibility.
Anti-GMO activists have become very skilled in places like Kauai and Maui in using political mechanisms such as referendum and recall, and amassing numbers, creating grassroots networks and so forth. This would be a logical next step, would you think?
I think it would. I mean, it's a big jump to move from being an outside activist to the member and to create a responsible political party. In political science, we always talk about parties in the electorate and parties in government, and that always is a struggle for third parties. Is if they do get someone elected, then who do they caucus with? How do they function in the American political system as a member of a governing coalition, not just radicals from the outside trying to push one party in a different direction?
What did the Libertarians gain, if anything, for 2 years ago in the elections? The gubernatorial election featured a candidate who was actually included in many of the debates, which we hadn't really seen before.
I think that this just gives them prominence. I mean, it is not a party label that many average voters really understand entirely. And so when they have a chance for their ideas to be heard, I mean, it resonates with a lot of people. And the more that they do that, I think the more it will.
People at least can become more familiar with libertarians.
That's right, that's right.
And Green Party and even independents. Now, just one last question about alternate parties. Is the independent party that Mufi Hannemann founded a party?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, with all respect to Mufi Hannemann, I think it was the Mufi Hannemann party, a way for him to run for governor. But there are possibilities there. I mean, it could become something. There really could be a Hawaii independent party that at the state level that tries to fill this hole that's been left by the Republicans. Because let's be clear, there's a lot of frustration with the Democratic Party here. I mean, there's a lot of people who have checked out because they see that it's the same incumbents every time. I mean, it's extraordinarily hard to lose your seat as a Hawaii Republican, no matter what you do, short of violating the law in many cases. And Governor Abercrombie is an extraordinary case, but aside from that, you're pretty much there for life, and I think people resent that.
You meant it's hard to lose your seat as a Hawaii Democrat.
Yes.
Now, we've talked about the presidential race. We've talked about legislative seats and so forth. Let's go in the middle of that sandwich, the governor of the state of Hawaii. What are your thoughts about Governor Ige and his first now almost 2 years?
Well, I'll say this for Governor Ige. He has delivered more, he's the person he campaigned as. I mean, he campaigned as the calm, cool technocrat who got excited about things like procurement and IT. I mean, really some of the most boring aspects of government. But he is who the people elected, and he is more or less doing what he said he was going to do. I mean, I think there's a real cost to that, which is it's very difficult to figure out if Governor Ige has any broad vision, if he's really willing to provide any vigorous leadership on any issues. I mean, I think that's something he feels very uncomfortable doing. He really, go ahead.
Yet there seem to be some issues in which he has become quite prominent, at least in the machinations of these as they become known. The 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea. He actually went up to the mountain itself and involved himself in direct negotiations there. Or at a larger scale, the next era Hawaiian Electric Industries merger, where he's been a very vocal spokesperson in opposition to it. Do you see these as leadership, or how do you evaluate the leadership being shown by these kinds of actions?
Well, so Ige governs in an unusual way for a governor, which is that the leadership he shows, I mean, with some exceptions for the 30-meter telescope, I mean, it does tend to be still about mobilizing coalitions in the way you would as a legislator. Not a lot of bully pulpit stuff. I mean, because he's not a particularly talented speaker, which he himself would admit. I mean, he does show leadership, but it's not about the leadership about molding public opinion. I mean, it's more about, I think, leadership from the governor's office trying to use his influence at the legislature and through the bureaucracy to push issues one way or another.
How is Ige doing, in your opinion, with the party itself? Do you anticipate any challenges midterm?
I think that, I mean, this, of course, was one of his selling points, that he had such a strong relationship with the local Democratic Party and legislators, something that Governor Abercrombie really didn't have, and that was very costly for him. I mean, I think he's doing well. I mean, he didn't, for example, his project on the $480 million or so he requested for OCCC that won't be funded. I mean, that's going to be a significant loss for him. But there haven't been any vocal opposition to him in the legislature, or even sort of less vocal but still very much present opposition. There's cost to that too, though. I mean, this is another thing. This is another cost. We already have a one-party state, and now we have a governor and a legislature that more or less like to decide everything behind the scenes. So the system is built to create conflict. There should be conflict between the legislature and the governor, and the fact that that is discouraged by the governor and we see so little of it, that is also cause for concern.
We live in a state, as you mentioned before, where a good number of people don't want others to talk stink. That's
right,
what we put
yeah.
it. Don't want politicians or people that rock the boat. So in some ways, Governor Ige represents this. And yet at the same time, we've got a state where people are voting for Bernie Sanders and for Donald Trump. Oh, how do you think that this dynamic might impact the preferences toward David Ige?
It's very difficult to balance those two ideas. I think it's compartmentalized a bit. I think people are happy with Ige, and they think of a totally different question when they're thinking about Bernie Sanders or the presidential level. But it does show that there's genuine frustration with the party here. I think they feel they've been unresponsive on issues like affordable housing. I mean, in some cases, it's just not clear how they respond in a really effective way. But that again may lead eventually to some support for a third party.
Well, with that, let me ask you a closing quick question, if you'll respond quickly. What would an emerging politician need to do in order to capture the hearts and minds of Hawaii's people and make it up as a Democrat or as a Republican breaking into the system?
Two things. The first, I think you need to promise more transparency than other candidates have in the past. I mean, that could be a core issue. We know that you can win if you're running against what people perceive as party corruption. The second is really to speak to the issues people care about, whether it's on the left or the right, affordable housing, the environment, I mean, trying to balance all of those issues. But I think responsiveness, openness would be a key part of any campaign.
So you think it's issues, not ideology?
I think it's issues, not ideology. I don't think our electorate is particularly ideological. And so if you're, so you'd want to focus on a few issues that would attract voters. And if it's any ideology, it's the ideology of openness and sunshine.
Well, very good. Colin, thank you so much for being
My
on
pleasure.
the program. Always enjoy talking with you. If you're like me, you have not only enjoyed, but you've learned from Colin Moore, a professor at the University of Hawaii and director of the University of Hawaii Public Policy Center. We'll be back again next week on Think Tech Hawaii's E Hana Kako, and until then, aloha.